Do you think Indonesia is leaning towards more social market economy, more Pancasila economy, or more liberal free market economy? Because our current challenges, Professor, is that we are already, as Indonesia, we're already moving from a lower income country to a middle income country.
When the economy collapsed, people weren't easily laid off. People still had access to health care. Yeah. People were protected by unemployment insurance, and unemployment insurance took care of health care.
Salam kerjasama. Mitra Kemendagri, selamat datang di obrolan kerjasama. Biasa kita sebut Orkes, sebuah obrolan kerjasama antara Kementerian Dalam Negeri dan Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Kami menghadirkan inspirasi bagi pemirsa sekalian berdasarkan berbagai hasil-hasil kerjasama antara Kementerian Dalam Negeri dan Yayasan Konrad Adenauer. Bersama saya Sadia Ma'ruf, kita akan memulai obrolan hari ini. Mitra Kemendagri, kita merasa sangat terhormat. Hari ini bersama kita ada Profesor Markus Marktanner. Beliau merupakan Associate Professor Ekonomi dan Manajemen Konflik Internasional di Kennesaw State University, Georgia. Beliau memiliki concern terhadap ekonomi pasar sosial di Jerman dan ekonomi Pancasila di Indonesia. Obrolan kita hari ini akan membahas soal apa sebenarnya ekonomi pasar sosial, kaitannya dengan ekonomi Pancasila di Indonesia, dan bagaimana sistem ini berhasil mengembangkan sistem ekonomi yang berpihak kepada rakyat. Kita menyapa bersama Profesor Markus Marktanner. Hello, Professor. It's great to have you with us. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's an honor for us.
Terima kasih for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Terima kasih, Professor. Allow me to begin with a personal story. Professor, can you share with us, with our audience and listener too, what leads you to focus on comparative economy, conflict economy, development economic theory?
I think that my interest in comparative economics has been somewhat ingrained in my upbringing. I was born and raised in West Germany, and therefore naturally exposed to the two Germans at the time.
Yeah.
Additionally, my mother, she is an expellee from Hungary after World War II. And I still remember how my grandfather was sitting with me during the winter playing games and talked about his home country, Hungary, and how much he misses it, and how he suffered when it became a socialist country, and after the Russians expelled him, he lost everything, and how sad he was. So I had naturally an interest also in socialist countries, and then as my career advanced, I was at the American University of Beirut between 2003 and 2011. And there I witnessed in 2005 the assassination of the Prime Minister, in 2006 the war with Israel. And from there it wasn't very difficult anymore to develop an interest also in conflict economics. And ultimately, development economics and conflict economics are very intertwined. And if you want to avoid conflict, you have to make sure that development takes place, and specifically equitable social development.
Yeah. Oh, well, then we're so lucky to have you here in Indonesia because, we're going to continue discussing, one of your expertise, comparative economy. We're going to further discuss about social market economy in Germany and also economy Pancasila in Indonesia. I will continue with social market economy, Professor. What we understand is that Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of Germany in democracy post World War II, have this model of social market economy. Can you share further how this model is implemented, some of the strategy that makes this model become the foundation of economic success in Germany?
Well, first of all, if you look at the basic law of Germany, it nowhere says that Germany is a social market economy. But in political debate, the term social market economy was always widely used. And it was handed to Konrad Adenauer by economists, and many of those economists, they also became eventually prominent political figures. Two worth mentioning are Alfred Müller-Armack and probably more importantly Ludwig Erhard, who was also the second chancellor. And social market economic thought developed in Germany at the time when Germany was really at the crossroads of its political future. At the one hand, you had the Bolshevist revolution in Russia, and socialism gained a little bit of political momentum. At the same time, after World War II, Germany lost World War II and was made reparation payments through the Treaty of Versailles and lost all its fiscal capacity and had to print money in order to finance public goods, but it ended up in a horrible inflation in 1923, and that clearly also shaped the mindset of Germans at the time. And then in 1929, the Great Depression happened, and after the Great Depression, many countries resorted again to nationalism and protectionism. And at this point, Germany just felt isolated and betrayed by the rest of the world. And that political popular frustration ultimately gave rise to fascism and Hitler coming to power. And it was around that time when a group of political thinkers and economic thinkers already knew that there will come a day when Germany is in need again of a new economic system. And those thinkers were more inclined towards a market system, clearly anti-socialist, but they were also skeptical about the market system. And they realized that the market system has certain harshnesses to it that need to be addressed. And that group developed concepts like economic humanism that also looked at the idea of the human being and how it is different from the philosophy in socialism and laissez-faire capitalism. And they ultimately developed a set of economic policies that have become known in Germany as ordoliberalism, meaning that a functioning economy is only possible within a certain framework, an order framework, and that ultimately became social market economic thought. But what is important to mention is that there was not only one single prominent thinker that really shaped social market economic thought. It was really a movement across different schools in Germany.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier that you grew up being exposed to different systems and different stories of movements and migrations and change. And social market economy, as you just mentioned, also is a product of dialogues, so to speak, with different political system and looking at what works and what not works in the background of post World War II context. And so I will continue by talking about change and also how a model can sustain despite of change, despite of different political interests and different regime now in peacetime. How does this model, social market economy, sustain despite of all those changes?
Ultimately, it's sustained itself by its very success. It was not easy right after World War II to introduce those economic reforms, because Germany was obviously laying in rumbles, and there was a fear that a return to a market system may bring about again certain harshnesses and vulnerabilities. But the social market economy somehow convinced people that within the framework of a system in which the market is actually becoming a driver of equitable social development, those harshnesses of the free, unregulated market can be harnessed. And over the first 10-15 years after World War II, the German economic miracle was clearly associated with social market economic thinking. But it would be wrong to say that between World War II and today, Germany always would have strictly followed social market economic principles. There were episodes when German politics deviated substantially from social market economic principles, and they were also corrected. So especially during the 1970s, during the oil price crisis, there was more like a adaptation of Keynesian macroeconomics, where the government played again a stronger role. But then beginning with the 1980s, there was again a return to more market liberal, ordo-liberal kind of policies. And today, with looking back at several crises like the 2008 financial crisis and now the pandemic, there seems to be again a greater return to more Keynesian economics, or where the state is supposed to assume a greater role. So there was always a back and forth between social market economic thinking and other ways of doing economic policy.
Yeah. In the middle of those changes, what do you see as the key as the key factors of success in German economy? Because clearly, until today, German is one of the biggest economy in the world, and that leads me to other question. Do you also see other countries implementing social market economy because of German success?
Other countries have been clearly inspired, I think, by the German experience after World War II. And many other countries have actually adopted the term social market economy. But not all of those countries that have adopted the term social market economy actually pursued strict social market economic principles. So, for example, Chile in Latin America has identified itself as a social market economy, and Pinochet used that term quite often. And other countries have done so too. What is really unique, I think, about Germany is that the term social market economy, or in German, die soziale Marktwirtschaft, has a great identification potential, which is almost similar to having like a national soccer team. Like when the Brazilians, they talk about their soccer team as the Seleção, or the French about Les Bleus.
Yeah.
And so in Germany, we are just very proud of the social market economy because we think it lifted us up from complete devastation after World War II to a very prosperous country where there is a lot of economic freedom, but also relatively high levels of equitable social development. And that clearly has inspired other countries. But other countries may not have necessarily called it social market economics. I mean, here in East Asia, the country that would come to my mind that is probably closest to social market economic thought is Taiwan. Taiwan is a country that emerged in very difficult geopolitical times after World War II as a breakaway republic from China. But it invested heavily in education and public health and infrastructure. So it provided a lot of public goods, and in retrospect, it has been quite successful in combining economic freedom with equitable social development, despite being hosted in a quite difficult geopolitical context.
Wow. You mentioned one example from East Asia that is successful in balancing economic freedom with equitable, social equitable development, which reminds me of our own economy in Indonesia, economy Pancasila, which I believe, and also many of us in Indonesia believe, heading towards that directions as well, balancing free market with social equitable measures. So we have universal health insurance, we have free education, and speaking of pride, Professor, we are also very proud to learn that you're also studying our economy, the Pancasila economy. Can you share a little bit, Professor, on how do you start or how do you get interested in economy Pancasila?
I got interested in Pancasila economics like 12 years ago when I was invited for the first time to Indonesia by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation to actually speak on the topic of the social market economy. And I heard people using the term Pancasila, and I didn't know what it is, and I felt ashamed for my ignorance and felt poorly prepared for my first visit. And then I started to read up on the concept of Pancasila economics, and I identified some parallels but also vast differences between the historical context of the social market economy and Pancasila economics. But the first thing that really attracted me is that Indonesia is one of the few countries that also has coined a specific term for its economic model. And as I mentioned earlier, there are not many countries that have that. The Germans would say, we have the social market economy, and Indonesia would say, we have Pancasila economics. But many other countries, when you ask people, you know, what is your economic system? They have nothing that really unites them and identifies them and rallies everyone behind a certain economic philosophy. And that by itself was already very fascinating. And then I started to read, of course, about the history, and then I looked into the similarities. And what is clearly standing out is the fact that from a philosophical normative perspective, in the sense of what is an economic system supposed to accomplish, namely equitable social development and prosperity, there is huge similarity between Pancasila economics and the social market economy. But when it comes to the actual political and economic policy implications, there are huge differences. So Pancasila economics obviously evolved in Indonesia, during Indonesia's struggle for independence. And of course, that colonial history shaped it. And when Sukarno introduced Pancasila economics, he was much more leaning towards a socialist model. Whereas when it was introduced in Germany, there was a clear propensity towards a market economy. So there were some differences. And even though in Germany, the concept of the social market economy had some ups and downs and there were some deviations to it, those deviations from the original concept were much more severe in Indonesia. So Pancasila economics under Sukarno is obviously very different than Pancasila economics under Suharto, but both instrumentalized that term, hoping that it will rally people behind a certain economic policy. And that is much different in Indonesia than it was in Germany. The rallying behind of Germans behind the idea of the social market economy was much smoother. It was much less characterized by extreme swings in economic policy. And yeah, I just found that very interesting. And of course, I'm curious to see where Pancasila economics is heading in the future.
Wow. Us too, I guess, in Indonesia, very curious to see, especially now that we are heading to another election in 2024, and also a major, economic challenges like post-COVID recovery, and also a global economy that is not, heading to the correct directions, I guess, with what's happening around the world. Professor, you mentioned that what you understand, there's a certain thing that you understand from Pancasila economy during Sukarno and Pancasila economy during Suharto. How do you see Pancasila economy in the current context? You mentioned that Germany remain somewhat consistent, no significant change. Do you think Indonesia still implement Pancasila economy because, we have our own challenges? For instance, we say Pancasila economy for a very long time, but we only have universal health coverage. I mean, we have to acknowledge that we only have universal health coverage in like 2014, and there's still, several gaps in terms of equitable social development. So how do you see Indonesia today in the context of, your understanding on Pancasila economy?
Well, first of all, I think that universal healthcare is in the spirit of both the social market economy and obviously Pancasila economics. But correct me if I'm wrong, I somehow feel that today politicians do not necessarily try to use the term Pancasila economics extensively. It seems to have lost a little bit its luster over the last couple of decades, probably since the end of the Suharto era. But I just would argue that it would be very important to initiate again a discussion about what Pancasila economics is supposed to be, and
that would be interesting,
and what the major principles are. Because if you just say, it rests on belief in one God and it humanity and identity and democracy and social justice, you need to beef it up a little bit with more specific policy recommendations. And I also think that whenever a certain law is being passed, that people should examine it really from those Pancasila principles and simply incorporate those principles more in public debate and policy dialogue. I haven't followed Indonesian politics that much recently, but from what I have seen or from what I have read is that the term is not widely used anymore. And in fact, I even checked the Economist newspaper and I looked how often does the term Panchasila economics, how often is it quoted relative to, for example, the social market economy, and it is barely mentioned. And I think this is just a missed opportunity.
Oh, well, I mean, to have Panchasila economy being more discussed, and also I guess that's a very important suggestions that every time a policy is passed, why not us as Indonesian looking at it from the perspective of Pancasila, especially social justice and democracy. Has this particular policy ensure social justice, or has this particular policy also, include voices of everyone, especially those who are severely impacted by, negative impact of development, so to speak. And what do you, Professor, if I may continue, following up to when policy has passed, we have to examine it in the context of Pancasila economy. What do you see as a priority improvement in Indonesia? Which policy should be improved, not only from the context of Pancasila economy, but from your understanding of social market economy as a successful economic model?
I think in order to make the idea of Pancasila economics more successful and more attractive and endowed with a greater appeal in public debate, I think one needs to stop thinking of the 5 principles as being hierarchical, that the first principle, believe in one God, should always come first, and then followed up by the principle of humanity, and then moving to unity and democracy and social justice. Because if you try to develop a certain policy response to a certain socioeconomic problem, I mean, at the end of the day, all economic problems are problems related to inequality.
Yeah.
And, if you take, for example, environmental degradation, I mean, there is clearly a group whose livelihood base is being destroyed, and that in itself already creates a form of social injustice. So if a problem exists that requires an economic policy response, I think it is always much better to start with addressing the issue of social injustice and not starting to address that problem with the first principle, but successively look at a certain problem. Let's say if we stay with the example of environmental degradation, so let's say there is an area that is heavily affected by pollution and something that destroys people's livelihood base. Well, one can do a lot of studies that show how that affects injustice, or how it drives injustice. And then we can continue and say, okay, how can we solve that problem? And we can ask, what role does democracy play? Are the people affected by environmental degradation? Are they appropriately represented by legitimate representatives? Or are there some frictions in the system that prevent those affected by a certain problem from raising their voice appropriately? And then we can do studies on those, and of course academia would play an important role in that one. And then we can move to the next principle, which is national identity. And of course one can also easily say that, once an environmental problem is being resolved and greater justice again restored, that ultimately promotes greater unity among the Indonesians, because ultimately there is an element of solidarity too. And then we can move to the next one of humanity. And also it is much easier to talk about the principle of humanity if we can already look at some policies that have initially addressed injustice and then democratic impediments and then their impact on unity. And then we can say, okay, how humane is that policy?
Yeah.
I mean, and with humanity, the way I understand it is that a humane economic policy is one that really addresses the grievances of marginalized groups or those affected by, to stay with the example, natural degradation. And a lot of people within civil society can write about that. And at the very last end, once an entire set of policy recommendations and discussions within those four principles have been conducted, I think then one can also present it to religious representatives and say, does that actually represent the belief in one God?
Yeah, yeah.
I would argue that this is much easier than to start the other way around.
Yeah. Oh, I agree with you, Professor, in thinking that we really should look at some of our issues, development issues, especially from the perspective of social justice first. We should try like social justice first and not considering it as priority number 5, I guess, because it's number 5. It doesn't mean that it's priority number 5. Now, speaking of social justice and also what you understand about what's happening in Indonesia today. Do you think Indonesia is leaning towards more social market economy, more Pancasila economy, or more liberal free market economy? Because our current challenges, Professor, is that we are already, as Indonesia, we're already moving from a lower income country to a middle income country. But we are worried, of course, and it's being discussed in the media quite often as well, the term of middle income trap, that we're going to stay here and not moving forward. So my question is, I guess, from what you see happening and implemented in Indonesia today, is it more towards social market economy, Pancasila economy, or liberal economy, and maybe some suggestions on how we really, move forward in a more, you're heading towards, social equitable development, more prosperous nations, and to avoid those, middle income trap?
Oh, that's a difficult question, but clearly the post-Suharto era, I would argue, is clearly more in line with Pancasila and social market economic principles. But to say where Indonesia is currently heading, is it more like a liberal economy? I don't think that under Jokowi, the idea of, let's say, laissez-faire capitalism is viable. So I think we can rule that out. And I wouldn't make necessarily too much of a distinction between is it a social market economy or is it Pancasila, because they could be very similar in political practice. The only difference between a social market economy and Pancasila economics is that we don't really know yet what Pancasila economics really means in political practice. And I just wish for more political dialogue in that direction. But yeah, I found it difficult to answer that question clearly. Sorry.
But more political dialogue. More political dialogue, definitely, as you recommend earlier, to just have a very, clear understanding, clear directions of policy as well, and that could be achieved through a more consistent political dialogue and political debate on policies, priority, and economic development.
Correct. Ultimately, what would be the ideal in order to really promote Panchasila economics as a truly viable form of economic policy making is to have wide public debate that involves especially academia and trying to examine all kinds of socioeconomic problems through the lens of those 5 principles that we just talked about, and really promote it and not just stay in the ivory tower of a university, but really try to reach out and not only to social media, but also newspaper and TV shows and podcasts. And that is what happened with social market economics in Germany. There was a very vibrant academic movement, and as I said earlier, there was not one single person that has shaped social market economic thought. Those were like different economic schools under different names. One school identified itself as economic humanism, another one as ordoliberalism, and they worked together. And they did not stay in their ivory tower. They actively sought political dialogue, and their aspiration was to shape public debate. And that is what I would wish for in Indonesia to happen as well.
I think this is one of the emphasis to our audience as well. More political public debate and for all of us, academics, politicians, media, to not, sit in ivory tower being comfortable, but really pushing through wider public debate on our economic system and how we want to lead our development. Professor, Indonesia is really, gearing up towards economic development at the forefront of many of our priorities and policies. Investments is definitely one of our priorities as well. But history proves that now we are experiencing or being affected by the impact of heavy industrializations throughout the history. Now, how do you see us, moving forward towards economic development without compromising the environment?
Yeah, that's a good question, and obviously a huge challenge. But economic development means sustainable economic development. Development on the back of Mother Nature is not development. So, obviously, if one drafts economic policies, it is important to take environmental aspects into account. Ultimately, Mother Nature provides the resources that we draw from, and that ultimately drives economic development. And since economics is the science of allocating scarce resources efficiently, it is important to make sure that scarce natural resources are handled accordingly. And it can be done through certain laws, like some countries have introduced, for example, the crime of ecocide.
Oh, wow.
And that is a good signal. But in very simple terms, sustainable development in line with the protection of the environment requires that we need to find an appropriate price for the use of natural resources, be it whether we use the air as a dumpster for carbon emissions, or whether we use the ocean as a dumpster for waste, or land as a dumpster for waste. The basic problem is that we use a natural resource, but nobody has to pay a price for it.
Right.
So what needs to happen is that we need to find a price for it. And that often can be done by giving people the right to say, I don't allow you to dump your waste on my land by advancing property rights. It can also be done by having a bold government that says, look, if somebody wants to emit pollutants into the environment, they have to pay a tax.
Yeah.
And from an economic perspective, this is not a real challenge. I mean, the economic answer to sustainable environmental or to environmentally sustainable development is relatively easy. At the end of the day, it is a political problem, and very often, if we look at countries that rely heavily on the extraction of their natural resources, very often government is also captured by those industries, and those industries become very effective in preventing environmentally sustainable policies. And that again is ultimately a democracy problem.
Yeah.
And it is also a social justice problem. And it is just another great example, I would argue, that may serve as an example to discuss those Panchasila economic elements in order to address it. But from a purely economic perspective, development and environmental sustainability, they naturally belong together and are not two different pairs of shoes.
That's true. That's true. I mean, I agree that they naturally belong together, because if we exhaust resources, then we destroy not only the environment but also the economy. And you mentioned on putting price on resources that we use, air and land and trees. They're not free, like provided. And also, but political will. That's true. Yeah. That is something that we have to strongly emphasize, because from the perspective of economy, you just calculate the number and choose the best direction. Yeah.
My only fear is that political will ultimately emerge, but very often political change occurs when things are already really bad and people don't have any alternative. I mean, very often people ask me, how do we introduce economic reforms? And the answer that I feel is the only feasible answer, if you look at the history of economic reforms, is that economic reforms are the easiest to implement when things are at their worst. It was very easy in Germany to introduce economic reforms because we didn't have an alternative.
Well, speaking of things at their worst, we are, well, at our worst, at some, in some contexts, we are in the middle of post-pandemic recovery, and in the middle of all of that, we have also Russia, Ukraine, a war that creates, of course, a major disruptions to value chain, export, import, and it's not like economy is the only thing that we care about. Of course, this is a humanitarian crisis, war, unemployment, post-COVID unemployment. Many people are just health care crises. And how do you see it, or can you suggest some things, some strategies, directions for us, Indonesia, to also handle this? Because, I mean, your last statement brought such hope. Change is easier. Economic reform is easier when things are at their worst. So maybe this is really the time.
I mean, you mentioned the war in the Ukraine and the pandemic, and even though they seem to be very different, they both point a little bit at the effectiveness of, for example, social market economic principles but also theoretically Panchasila economic principles. Because if you look at the invasion of Russia, if you look at Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, I mean, if I look at Russia's economy, it has been a complete failure. It is a natural resource-rich country where life expectancy has been on the decline, where alcoholism has been on the rise, where job creation has never really taken place. And Russia has been a prime example of inequitable social development with a corrupt, oligarchic economic system. But ultimately, Russia had to realize that it has nothing to offer to its people in terms of sound economic development. And that is very dangerous, because whenever you have political leaders who are not subject to checks and balances of the democratic system, those political leaders need to develop and need to deliver something. And very often they resort then to political adventurism by creating a war. And if there is no economic success to appeal to, they try to appeal to some military might or to the restoration of past glory of the Russian Empire. And that is ultimately what's happening, I think, in Russia today. But it would not have happened if Russia had been a prosperous economy where people enjoyed individual freedoms and economic freedoms, access to education, and ultimately witnessed equitable social development. Russia got ever more unequal. And when it comes to the pandemic, there are huge differences in the handling of the pandemic. I mean, China pursues a zero COVID strategy, which looked very successful in the early days, and a lot of people around the world admire China for its handling of the pandemic. But that has changed a little bit over the last couple of years, as people realize that those lockdowns become very costly in terms of foregone economic development. And the United States pursued a very different strategy, and the United States had to pay for it in different ways by having to accept more COVID deaths. But staying with the countries, or the three countries, Germany and the US and China, I think now that after 2 years, I think Germany can proudly say that it handled the pandemic among all the countries most successfully. And I think a huge part of the success can be attributed to that social market economic spirit that has prevailed over the pandemic, where when the economy collapsed, people weren't easily laid off, people still had access to health care, people were protected by unemployment insurance, and unemployment insurance took care of health care, so people could see a doctor. People weren't afraid that they still need to go to work even if they felt sick. And ultimately, I feel that the social market economy was like a repellent to the virus as well, as much as vaccination.
Wow, social market economy as virus repellent, as much as vaccinations. Indeed, I mean, if people can stay, at least stay afloat and have jobs and can still afford healthcare, or being supported to access healthcare, even bare minimum, that would mean better directions for a country.
I agree.
Yes, and speaking of better direction for a country, Professor, Indonesia is going to celebrate 77th independence in August 17, 2022. So very soon, we're talking about political debate. We're talking about message to academics, to policymakers throughout our discussions. Maybe you want to say something for this Independence Day to Indonesian people.
Well, thanks for that invitation. And I noticed that whenever we talk about economics, the negative somehow prevails over the positive elements. And I have been visiting Indonesia over the last 12 years quite regularly. And I need to say it is an admirable country that can be very proud of its history, which is not only the world's largest Muslim country, it is also the world's largest Muslim democracy. And Indonesia internationally in economic politics really punches below its weight. And there is a lot of there are many shifts now I would expect over the future years in Southeast Asian or East Asian geopolitics. And I'm very sure that Indonesia has the potential to play a more proactive role in exercising extremely positive influence in international politics and also serving as a role model for many other countries, especially other Muslim countries that struggle with democracy. And Indonesia is a country that is the only one that has already seen several peaceful handovers of political power.
Very true.
And that is something that the country really can be proud of. And Indonesia has all the good reasons to celebrate its history.
Wow, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. It's a great honor to have you.
It's really
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you, terima kasih.
Mitra Kemendagri, terima kasih sudah mendengarkan, menyaksikan juga obrolan kami dengan Profesor Markus Mark Tanner. Semoga mendapatkan banyak insights dan pengetahuan baru ya, juga banyak reminder buat kita semua untuk mengingat kembali legacy warisan panjang dan luhur dari bangsa Indonesia dalam merayakan kemerdekaan kita yang ke-77. Mitra Kemendagri, setelah menyaksikan diskusi kita, kami mau bagi-bagi giveaway. Ada eksklusif tumbler dari Orkes yang caranya dapat dilakukan. Kamu pertama-tama follow Instagram kita di @OrkesFasker_Official. Sekali lagi follow Instagram kita di @OrkesFasker_Official. Dan kita juga mengharapkan mitra Kemendagri sekalian untuk menyaksikan video ini sampai akhir. Subscribe, like, komen, bagikan dengan lingkungan Anda supaya ingatan kita akan ekonomi Pancasila, juga hal yang baik warisan luhur bangsa kita tuh semakin menyebar luas bagi kita semua. Sekali lagi terima kasih Profesor Markus Mark Tanner yang telah berbagi kepada kita semua. Nah, mitra Kemendagri sekalian, sebelum kita berpisah ada sedikit pengingat untuk kita semua. Ekonomi pasar sosial dan ekonomi Pancasila, keduanya berpihak pada rakyat. Kebijakan yang adil diperlukan demi mewujudkan iklim usaha yang sehat. Tidak melulu pertumbuhan, tapi juga keadilan yang merata demi mewujudkan Indonesia yang maju dan sejahtera. Dirgahayu Republik Indonesia ke-77, pulih lebih cepat, bangkit lebih kuat. Saya Sadia Ma'ruf, undur diri, salam kerjasama.